Berlin, 1908. A sick old man is carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. An angry crowd spits at him, screaming, "Well, filthy sodomite, shameless perjurer." The prosecutor is relentless in his pursuit to imprison him, and the press brands him a disgrace to the empire. But this pitiful defendant was, until very recently, the shadow emperor of Germany. He was the only man Kaiser Wilhelm II let his guard down for, the only one he trusted enough to call Liebchen. In Prussia, where stiff uniforms and iron discipline were the only law, the man who held the Kaiser's heart in his hands was Philipp zu Eulenburg. Why was the emperor's closest friend, a man at the pinnacle of power, suddenly branded an enemy of the state and destroyed? This is not merely a political scandal. It is the brutal true story of how a forbidden relationship between two men at the very top of the most conservative empire on earth shook a nation to its core. We cannot grasp the magnitude of this fall by looking only at the wreckage of 1908. We must rewind the clock to the quiet moments before the storm, to an empire that was dangerously obsessed with masculinity. If you were standing on the Unter den Linden Boulevard in Berlin at the turn of the 20th century, watching the German Empire march past in all its spiked helmet glory, you would see a nation obsessed with strength. It was a society built on rigid discipline, ironclad hierarchies, and a deeply aggressive form of masculinity. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, with his upturned mustache and constant rattling of sabers, seemed the very embodiment of this armored state. But appearances can be terribly deceiving. Behind the marble facade of the imperial capital, behind the closed doors of country estates and private railway carriages, a very different world existed. It was a world of intense emotion, artistic sensitivity, and romantic entanglements between powerful men that defied the strict codes of the day. This parallel world revolved around two men. The first was Philipp zu Eulenburg. By Prussian standards, he was a glitch in the system. While his peers were obsessed with war, Eulenburg was a dreamer who composed music and wrote plays. He possessed an extraordinary gift for intimacy, a talent for making people feel deeply understood. This gift would have remained a footnote in history if not for the desperate hunger of another man, the future Kaiser, Prince Wilhelm. The bond between them makes no sense until we strip away the caricature of the warmongering Kaiser and look at the damaged human being underneath. Wilhelm was a victim of his own birthright. His upbringing was a regimen of torture disguised as education. He was forced to ride horses despite having no balance. He was subjected to bizarre cures for his withered left arm, including having it strapped into machines or placed inside the carcasses of freshly killed animals to absorb the vitality. By the time he was a young adult, Wilhelm was emotionally unstable, boastful, insecure, and desperately lonely. He constructed a persona of hypermasculinity to compensate for his physical weakness. He shouted because he was afraid of being ignored. He rattled his saber because he was terrified of being seen as weak. He was a man-child surrounded by sycophants, none of whom truly cared about his soul. Then he met Philipp. The year was 1886. Wilhelm was 27. Eulenburg was 39. They met at a hunting party, the standard social setting for their class. But while the other men were drinking and boasting about their kills, Eulenburg and Wilhelm found themselves in a different kind of conversation. Eulenburg didn't treat the prince with the stiff, terrified deference of a courtier, nor did he lecture him like a minister. He listened. He saw past the withered arm and the bombastic attitude. He saw the frightened, artistic, sentimental boy hiding inside the uniform. Eulenburg was everything Wilhelm was not: calm, culturally sophisticated, at peace with his emotions. For Wilhelm, meeting Eulenburg was like taking a first breath of air after drowning. He became instantly, overwhelmingly infatuated. This wasn't just friendship, it was emotional salvation. Eulenburg became the antidote to the stiff, suffocating atmosphere of the Berlin court. He became the father figure Wilhelm wished he had, the brother he never knew, and the confidant he desperately needed. Their connection deepened with frightening speed. They began spending weeks together on hunting trips, but the hunting was often secondary to long, late-night conversations by the fireplace. While the rest of Germany was hardening itself for industrial warfare, the future Kaiser and his best friend were singing ballads at the piano. Eulenburg would sing his own compositions, often sentimental songs about northern landscapes, rose gardens, and mystical themes. He had a soft, pleasant baritone voice. Wilhelm would sit enthralled, sometimes turning the pages of the sheet music, sometimes resting his hand on Eulenburg's shoulder. The letters they exchanged during these early years tell a story of profound emotional dependency, particularly on Wilhelm's part. The future Emperor of Germany wrote to Eulenburg with the unguarded affection of a schoolboy crush. He would sign letters as your faithful friend, or sometimes use intimate nicknames. Eulenburg was Philine, a softness that defied his gender. Wilhelm was Liebchen, or simply the beloved. Eulenburg, in turn, addressed the prince with a warmth that bordered on the romantic, though he was always careful to maintain the deference due to a future monarch. We must pause here and address the nature of this relationship, because it is the hinge upon which the entire scandal later turns. Looking back with 21st century eyes, it is easy to immediately categorize this. Two men, intense emotional intimacy, pet names, late nights, a distaste for traditional masculinity. It sounds like a gay romance. And indeed, many historians argue it was exactly that. Eulenburg was certainly bisexual, he had a wife and children, but his history of romantic attachments to men was long and documented. However, the late 19th century had a different vocabulary for male friendship. Intense, passionately expressed bonds between men, romantic friendships, were culturally acceptable in the German aristocracy, provided they remained within certain bounds of respectability, and crucially, were presumed to be non-sexual. It was an era of sentimentalism. Men walked arm in arm. They wrote poetry to each other. They wept openly at operas, together. The line between platonic love and sexual desire was blurry, and many men lived comfortably in that blur. Whether the relationship between Wilhelm and Eulenburg crossed the physical line into sex is something we will likely never know for sure. Wilhelm was terrified of scandal and deeply religious. Eulenburg was cautious. But whether they were lovers in the bedroom matters less than the fact that they were lovers in the soul. Eulenburg possessed the Kaiser's heart. He was the only man in Germany who could tell the Kaiser the truth, the only one who could calm his nerves when international crises loomed. He could talk Wilhelm down from the ledge of a tantrum with a few soft words and a song. By the time Wilhelm ascended the throne in 1888, becoming Kaiser Wilhelm II, Philipp zu Eulenburg was unofficially the second most powerful man in the Reich. He held no high cabinet office, preferring to operate in the shadows. He didn't want the scrutiny of being chancellor. He wanted the influence of the favorite. He accepted the post of ambassador to Vienna, a prestigious role that kept him physically distant from Berlin politics, but allowed him to maintain his private channel to the Kaiser. This unique position naturally created enemies, and in the shark tank of Prussian politics, having enemies was dangerous, but having the wrong enemies was fatal. Eulenburg's rise coincided with the twilight years of the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was the architect of the German Empire, a man of cynicism, power, and ruthlessness. He viewed the world as a chessboard. Bismarck despised Eulenburg. He didn't just dislike his politics, he was physically repulsed by his nature. Bismarck, the epitome of the hard, heavy-set, beer-drinking Prussian male, looked at the slender, artistic, perfume-scented Eulenburg and felt a deep, visceral disgust. He famously noted that Eulenburg had eyes like a seal, cold, liquid, unreadable, and, in Bismarck's view, slimy. He saw Eulenburg as a soft man, an effeminate courtier who was sapping the Kaiser's martial vigor. But Bismarck also feared him. He realized that this troubadour, as he mockingly called him, had the Kaiser's ear in a way he never would. Bismarck tried to control the young Kaiser through intimidation and policy. Eulenburg controlled him through affection. It was a battle between the old guard of iron and the new circle of sentiment. In 1890, when the young Kaiser finally forced Bismarck to resign, ending the era of the Iron Chancellor, many saw Eulenburg's hand guiding the dagger. With Bismarck gone, Eulenburg's influence was unchecked. He became the gatekeeper. If you wanted to reach the Kaiser, you had to go through Philipp. He mediated disputes between ministers. He advised on foreign policy, usually urging caution and peace, trying to restrain Wilhelm's aggressive impulses. He was trying to steer the ship of state with a conductor's baton rather than a rudder. His power base wasn't in the Reichstag Parliament building or the grandiose palaces of Berlin. It was at his family estate, Liebenberg, located about 60 kilometers north of the capital. Liebenberg became an escape hatch for the Kaiser. Wilhelm hated the formal court in Berlin, with its rigid protocols and endless staring eyes. He loved Liebenberg. He would arrive with a small retinue and immediately relax. The atmosphere that Eulenburg cultivated there was unique. It was almost bohemian. The estate was beautiful, surrounded by deep forests and parklands. The days were spent hunting, yes, but the evenings were the main event. The group that gathered there became known to history as the Liebenberg Circle. It included other aristocrats, diplomats like Kuno von Moltke, the military commandant of Berlin, and various artists and intellectuals. These men shared Eulenburg's distaste for the crude militarism that dominated official society. At Liebenberg, the stiff Prussian uniforms were often traded for more comfortable attire. They didn't talk about artillery specs, naval tonnage, or colonial acquisitions in Africa. They talked about art, philosophy, spiritualism, and the occult. They held seances. Eulenburg would sit at the piano and perform. The Kaiser, usually so tense and manic, would sit back, smoke his cigar, and let the music wash over him. He felt safe there. He felt loved. For Wilhelm, these weekends were therapy. For Eulenburg, they were the peak of his existence. He was the master of ceremonies, the orchestrator of the monarch's happiness. He believed he was doing a service to the nation by keeping the Kaiser sane. He used these relaxed settings to gently steer the Kaiser towards what he believed were more moderate, sensible policies. He was the White Knight, protecting the king from the Black Knights of the military staff. But to the outside world, to the hard-bitten generals and the rising class of aggressive nationalists in Berlin, something about Liebenberg smelled wrong. They couldn't see what was happening inside the estate, but they could imagine, and their imaginations were fueled by deep-seated prejudices. They saw a camarilla, a secret cabal, isolating the Kaiser. They saw a ring of effeminate men who were making the German emperor soft. They resented that access to the monarch was controlled not by his ministers, but by this circle of artistic aristocrats who preferred poetry to parades. They began to wonder, what exactly is the nature of this hold Eulenburg has over the emperor? Why does the Kaiser prefer the company of the harpist, as they mocked him, over his generals? The whispers began in the 1890s, low and quiet. They circulated in the officers' messes and the political salons. They were jokes, innuendos, raised eyebrows. Have you heard who the Kaiser is with this weekend? Ah, the troubadour again. One wonders what they do in the dark. At first, Eulenburg ignored them. He felt protected by his status and his friendship. He was an ambassador, a count, later prince, and the Kaiser's best friend. Who would dare touch him? He didn't realize that the ground beneath his feet was shifting. Germany was changing. The old deferential society was cracking. A new, aggressive, populist press was rising, and the definition of masculinity was narrowing. In the background of all of this hung the shadow of the law. Since the founding of the German Empire in 1871, the Penal Code had included paragraph 175. This law made sexual acts between men a crime punishable by prison. It was a harsh law, but in practice it was a class-based weapon. It was rarely enforced against the high aristocracy. The police knew better than to kick down the doors of princes and counts. It was a tool used against working-class men in the shadowy underworld of Berlin's parks and public toilets. But the law existed. It was a sword hanging by a thread. And as the new century dawned, as the political enemies of Eulenburg grew more desperate to break his hold on power, they began to look at that sword with new interest. They didn't care about morality. They didn't care about the Bible or the Penal Code's sanctity. They cared about power. They saw a man who was vulnerable. They saw a relationship that looked suspicious. And they realized that if they could define that relationship as criminal rather than sentimental, they could bring down the entire structure of the Kaiser's personal rule. The fuse was laid. It just needed a match. And in the bustling, smoky offices of a Berlin magazine, a man named Maximilien Harden was reaching for his lighter. If you walked the streets of Berlin in 1906, you would feel a vibration in the pavement that hadn't been there a decade before. The city was exploding. It was becoming a modern metropolis of electric trams, neon signs, and a population that had doubled in a generation. But the biggest change wasn't in the architecture. It was in the information. Germany was experiencing a media revolution. Newspapers were no longer just dry gazettes for the elite. They were mass-market weapons. They were loud, they were sensational, and they were hungry for blood. In this new jungle of ink and scandal, one predator stood at the top of the food chain, Maximilien Harden. To understand the destruction of Philipp zu Eulenburg, you have to understand the man who hunted him. Harden was a complex, fascinating contradiction. Born Felix Ernst Witkowski to a middle-class Jewish merchant family, he had reinvented himself completely. He converted to Protestantism, changed his name, and adopted the persona of a fierce, uncompromising German nationalist. He was an outsider desperate to be the ultimate insider, a man who loved the German Empire so much he wanted to burn down its government to save it. Harden was the editor of Die Zukunft, The Future, a weekly political magazine that was the must-read publication for the German intelligentsia. It was a one-man show. Harden wrote most of it himself in a dense, fiery, almost biblical style. He saw himself as a prophet, a voice crying out in the wilderness against the corruption of the age. And the corruption he hated most was the personal regime of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Harden was a devotee of the old Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. He believed in realpolitik, power politics, strength, decisive action. He looked at the Kaiser's court and saw the opposite. He saw vacillation. He saw a foreign policy that was erratic and weak, particularly towards France and England. He saw a Kaiser who talked a big game but retreated when things got real. And he was convinced he knew why. It wasn't just the Kaiser's personality, it was the people whispering in his ear. Harden believed that the Liebenberg circle, Eulenburg, Kuno von Moltke, and their friends, formed a camarilla, a secret shadow government that was insulating the Kaiser from reality. He believed their pacifism, their spiritualism, and their soft natures were acting as a tranquilizer on the German state. In Harden's mind, they were a distinct political threat. To remove the threat, he had to destroy the men. But how do you destroy the Kaiser's best friends? You can't attack them for their politics because they hold no official office. You have to attack them for who they are. Harden didn't act alone. Every assassin needs a supplier, and Harden found his in the darkest corner of the German government, the Foreign Office. There sat a man named Friedrich von Holstein. History knows him as the Gray Eminence. For decades, Holstein had been the spider in the web of German diplomacy. He was a master of intrigue, a man who collected secrets like other men collected stamps. He lived in a small apartment, rarely went out, and manipulated ministers like puppets. Holstein had once been an ally of Eulenburg, but by 1906 the relationship had turned into bitter hatred. Eulenburg had helped push for Holstein's resignation, and the old spider wanted revenge. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew about the romantic friendships. He knew about the rumors from Vienna and Munich, and so the disgruntled bureaucrat began to feed information to the crusading journalist. It was a lethal partnership. Holstein provided the bullets and Harden fired the gun. The attack began not with a shout, but with a whisper that turned into a scream. Throughout late 1906, Die Zukunft began publishing a series of articles that were masterpieces of innuendo. Harden didn't name names, not yet. The censorship laws were strict, and he had to be careful. Instead, he used a code that was decipherable to anyone in Berlin's high society. On November 17, 1906, he published an article titled Praelectio. In it, he spun a mythological tale about a harpist, Eulenburg, and his circle of sweeties, Liebchen, who had ensnared the king. He wrote about their abnormal inclinations. He described an atmosphere of unmanly affection that had turned the court into a place of decadence. The harpist, Harden wrote, was a man who sings the king to sleep while the enemies of Germany sharpen their knives. He painted a picture of a Kaiser who was being kept in a dream world, surrounded by a ring of silence protecting his favorites. The effect was electric. In the cafes of Berlin, the magazine sold out instantly. People read the passages aloud, decoding the references. The harpist is Eulenburg, obviously. Who is sweetie? That must be Molke. The use of the term sweetie, or Süßer in German, a common slang for homosexuals at the time, was a deliberate, brutal stroke. It stripped these high-ranking aristocrats of their dignity and reduced them to caricatures. But the most dangerous implication was the one Harden left unsaid. If the Kaiser's closest friends were all men of this specific persuasion, men who engaged in illegal and immoral acts, what did that say about the Kaiser? Was he one of them? Or was he just a fool? For months, the elite tried to ignore it. The ring of silence that Harden wrote about was real. The court officials, the generals, the ministers, they all read the articles, but nobody dared to show them to the Kaiser. Wilhelm II lived in a bubble of deference. He was notoriously thin-skinned, and his staff were terrified of his temper. No one wanted to be the messenger who told the All-Highest that his best friend was being called a sodomite in the weekly press. So, a bizarre situation developed. All of Berlin was talking about the Eulenburg scandal. except for the three men most affected: Eulenburg, who was away in Switzerland trying to recover his health, Moltke, and the Kaiser. Harden grew impatient. The innuendo wasn't working fast enough. He needed to force a confrontation. He escalated his attacks. He began to hint that this wasn't just a moral issue, but a national security threat. He raised the specter of blackmail. If the French or the British knew about the private lives of the Kaiser's inner circle, they could leverage that information. Germany was vulnerable because its leaders were compromised. This was the argument that finally moved the military caste. The officers of the Prussian Guard, the heart of the army, were apoplectic. Kuno von Moltke was one of their own, a lieutenant general. To have him mocked as Sweetie was an insult to the uniform. They demanded action. The silence had to be broken, and the man who finally broke it was the Kaiser's own son, Crown Prince Wilhelm. The Crown Prince was a different creature from his father, more popular, more dashing, and far more aligned with the hardline militarists. He disliked Eulenburg's influence. On May 2, 1907, urged on by his military friends, the Crown Prince walked into his father's study carrying a stack of Harden's magazines. The scene must have been excruciating. The Kaiser was in a good mood, perhaps planning his summer sailing trip. The Crown Prince, stiff and formal, laid the magazines on the desk. "Papa," he reportedly said, you must read this. All of Berlin is talking about it. The reputation of the monarchy is at stake." Wilhelm II picked up the magazines. He read. And as he read, his face drained of color. The bubble burst. The reality of the world outside his palace walls crashed in on him. He saw the insults, the mockery, the insinuations about his harpist and his faithful friend. His reaction was not one of loyalty or defiance. It was panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. Wilhelm's entire self-image was built on the idea of being the supreme, masculine warlord. The suggestion that his court was a nest of homosexual vice was terrifying to him. He didn't ask if it was true. He didn't call Eulenburg to ask for his side of the story. He immediately went into damage control mode. He demanded that the accused men clear their names. "They must sue," he raged. "They must drag this scribbler into court and prove him a liar, or they can never show their faces here again." He sent a peremptory order to Kuno von Moltke: "Sue Harden for libel, or resign your commission." There was no middle ground. The Kaiser needed a judicial verdict to hide behind. He needed a judge to tell him that his friends were innocent so he could go back to sleep. Kuno von Moltke was devastated. He was a gentle soul, a man who loved music and quiet evenings. He was not a fighter. He knew deep down that a public trial would be a disaster. He knew that his private life, his failed marriage, his intimate letters, all of it would be dragged out. But he had a direct order from his emperor. As a Prussian officer, he had no choice. Moltke filed a criminal libel suit against Maximilien Harden. The trap was sprung. This was exactly what Harden wanted. In the German legal system of the time, the defendant in a libel case had the right to prove the truth of their statements to avoid conviction. If Harden could prove that Moltke was indeed homosexual, then calling him one wasn't libel. It was fact. Harden prepared for the trial like a general preparing for war. He didn't rely on rumors anymore. He hired private investigators. He scoured the underworld of Berlin. He reached out to Moltke's vindictive ex-wife, Lily von Elbe. He was gathering an arsenal of dirt that was unprecedented in German history. The stage was set for the trial of the century. But it was more than a trial. It was a collision between two eras. On one side stood the old world of the aristocracy, privileged, private, operating on codes of honor and silence. On the other side stood the modern world, loud, democratic, intrusive, demanding transparency and truth, no matter the cost. On October 23, 1907, the curtain rose at the Schöffengericht Berlin Moabit. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. Journalists from New York, London, and Paris fought for seats. The air was thick with cigar smoke and anticipation. General Kuno von Moltke entered the court, looking pale and shaken, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame. Maximilien Harden entered looking like a predator who had smelled blood. He sat with his lawyers, his table piled high with documents. The proceedings began, and within hours, the dignity of the German Empire began to disintegrate. Harden didn't play by the rules of polite society. He asked brutal, direct questions. He asked about the nature of Moltke's feelings for Eulenburg. He read intimate letters aloud, dissecting words of affection with a scalpel, twisting sentimental phrases into evidence of perversion. "You wrote to him, 'My soul longs for you,'" Harden would thunder. "Is that how one general writes to another?" Moltke, stammering, tried to explain the concept of romantic friendship. "It is purely spiritual," he pleaded. "It is the union of souls." But in the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, his explanations sounded weak. They sounded like excuses, and Harden had a surprise weapon. He brought forward a witness named Bohlhardt, a soldier. Bohlhardt testified that he had participated in champagne parties at Moltke's villa, parties that devolved into orgies. The court gasped. The starfish fisherman story from the Villa d'Este was brought up, a confused, lurid tale of aristocrats frolicking with Italian peasants. It didn't matter if the stories were true or exaggerated or complete fabrications. The mere fact that they were being spoken aloud in a Prussian court was a revolution. The judge, a conservative man, was overwhelmed. He tried to maintain order, but the courtroom was a circus. The public was seeing their leaders naked for the first time. The mystique of the aristocracy, the idea that they were better than the common man, was dissolving in a puddle of sordid testimony. But the most damaging blow was yet to come. Harden realized that destroying Moltke was just the appetizer. He needed to link Moltke inextricably to Eulenburg. He needed to prove that this wasn't just one sick man, but a network. As the first days of the trial concluded, the mood in Berlin shifted from shock to anger. The Kaiser, watching from afar, realized with growing horror that his plan had backfired. The trial wasn't clearing his friends. It was convicting them in the eyes of the public. He had opened Pandora's box, and the demons were swarming out, heading straight for the throne. The tragedy of the Eulenburg affair was moving into its second, more brutal phase. The specific target was no longer just the softness of the court. It was the man himself. Philipp zu Eulenburg, watching from his exile, knew that his turn was coming. The hunt was on. The Schöffengericht Berlin Moabit was not designed for the circus it had become. It was a place of solemn Prussian justice, smelling of floor wax and old paper. But in October 1907, it smelled of sweat, fear, and cheap cigar smoke. The aisles were choked with spectators, dandies in silk ties, rough laborers in flat caps, and journalists scribbling furiously in sketch pads. They were all there to see the same thing, the dissection of a general. General Kuno von Moltke sat in the dock, a figure of tragic absurdity. He was a man who had led troops, a man whose family name was synonymous with military genius. But here, stripped of his epaulettes and his dignity, he looked small. He was fighting for his reputation, but he was fighting with weapons that were useless in this new century. He spoke of soul friendship and spiritual affinity. His opponent, Maximilien Harden, spoke of biology, pathology, and cold, hard facts. And then the doors of the courtroom opened to admit a witness who would change the nature of the trial, and perhaps history, forever. Called Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. A hush fell over the room as the small bespectacled doctor made his way to the stand. Hirschfeld was an alien creature to the stiff, aristocratic judges. He was a sexologist, a socialist, a Jew, and an outspoken advocate for the repeal of paragraph 175. He was the most dangerous man in Germany, not because he had an army, but because he had a theory. Harden had called him as an expert witness. His strategy was devious. He wanted Hirschfeld to look at Moltke and diagnose him. Hirschfeld, however, had his own agenda. He was a humanitarian. He believed that homosexuality, or inversion as he called it, was a natural biological variation, a third sex deeply rooted in a person's constitution. He believed that if he could prove to the court that men like Moltke were born that way, the law would eventually have to change. He thought he was there to save Moltke. He looked at the general. He listened to the descriptions of Moltke's artistic temperament, his lack of interest in women, his emotional sensitivity. And then, with the calm detachment of a scientist, Hirschfeld delivered his verdict to the court. The general, Hirschfeld testified, is a typical example of the spiritual homosexual. He meant it as a defense. He was trying to say, look, this man isn't a criminal. He is simply a different type of human being. He can't help it. But to Kuno von Moltke and to the Prussian officers sitting in the gallery, it wasn't a defense. It was a death sentence. To be called a homosexual in open court, even a spiritual one, was to be branded a defective, a mutant, a biological error. Moltke turned ashen. He tried to protest, to explain that he had been married, that he was a man of God. But the label had stuck. Hirschfeld, in his naivety, had handed Harden the victory. The court now had scientific proof that the general was exactly what the journalist said he was. The trial ended in a catastrophe for the establishment. The judge, swayed by Hirschfeld's testimony and the sheer volume of scandalous evidence, acquitted Maximilien Harden. The verdict hit Berlin like a mortar shell. By acquitting Harden of libel, the court was legally stating that Harden had told the truth. A Prussian court had just officially declared that the military commandant of Berlin was a homosexual. The Kaiser was apoplectic. The ring of silence was not just broken, it was pulverized. The monarchy was being laughed at in every beer hall in Munich and every salon in Paris. The French press was having a field day publishing cartoons of German generals in tutus. Wilhelm II could not let this stand. The verdict had to be reversed. The prestige of the crown demanded a victim, and it demanded a victory. The state machine ground into gear. The Kaiser pressured the Ministry of Justice. The previous trial was declared void on technicalities. A new trial was ordered. This time, it wouldn't be a civil suit. It would be a state criminal libel trial. The full weight of the German government would be thrown against Maximilien Harden to crush him and clear Moltke's name. But Harden was not a man who frightened easily. If the Kaiser wanted a war, Harden would give him a total war. He realized that going after Moltke was no longer enough. Moltke was a small fish. To survive the state's counterattack, Harden needed to aim higher. He needed to strike at the head of the snake. He needed Philipp zu Eulenburg. Eulenburg had been watching the Moltke disaster from afar, terrified. He had returned to Germany, hoping to testify quietly and clear his name, but now he realized he was walking into a trap. Harden began to turn his guns directly on the prince. He published new articles, more vicious than before. He mocked Eulenburg's illness, calling it diplomatic neurasthenia. He dared Eulenburg to come to court. And then a ghost from the past emerged to seal Eulenburg's fate. Her name was Lily von Elbe. She was Kuno von Moltke's ex-wife. She was a woman scorned, bitter, and possibly mentally unstable. But she possessed a weapon of mass destruction, her memory. Harden found her. He courted her. He listened to her stories of a sexless marriage, of a husband who spent his nights playing the piano and weeping over letters from Philine. And then he put her on the stand in the second trial. Lily von Elba's testimony was the stuff of nightmares for the Prussian elite. She didn't hold back. She described the intimate atmosphere of the Liebenberg circle. But she dropped the biggest bomb when she spoke about Eulenburg. My husband told me, she told the hushed courtroom, that his true love, the only one who understood his soul, was Philipp. She described finding a handkerchief of Eulenburg's that her husband kept like a holy relic. She described the way the men looked at each other. It was hearsay, it was emotional, and it was devastating. She linked Moltke and Eulenburg together in a web of deceit. The pressure on Eulenburg was now unbearable. The Kaiser sent word, "End this." Philipp zu Eulenburg was cornered. If he stayed silent, he was guilty by omission, and his family name would be ruined. If he admitted the truth, even a fraction of it, he would go to prison for violating paragraph 175, and the Kaiser would be implicated by association. He chose the only path he thought was left. He chose to lie. But he had to lie so convincingly, so completely, that no one could ever question him again. In May 1908, in a separate hearing designed to settle the matter once and for all, Philipp zu Eulenburg raised his right hand. He looked the judge in the eye. He was 61 years old, sick and trembling, but his voice was steady. He swore a religious oath. He swore by Almighty God that he had never in his entire life engaged in any unnatural acts with men. He swore he had never violated paragraph 175. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. He wasn't just denying a specific crime. He was denying his entire nature. He was betting that the court and the public would respect the word of a prince over the accusations of a journalist. He was betting on the old code of honor, but Maximilien Harden had anticipated this. He had been waiting for this exact moment. The moment Eulenburg swore that oath, the trap snapped shut. Perjury, Harden whispered to his lawyers. Harden had not been idle. While the trials were raging, his private investigators had been scouring the Bavarian countryside, where Eulenburg had owned a lakeside villa decades ago in the 1880s. They were looking for the simple people, the boatmen, the fishermen, the servants, people the prince would have forgotten, people who were invisible to the aristocracy, and Harden had found them. He found a milkman named Riedel. He found a fisherman named Stadel, two rough working-class men from the Starnberger Sea, and they had stories to tell. They told Harden's investigators about the nice nobleman who used to visit them in the 1880s, the nobleman who liked to take late-night boat rides, the nobleman who gave them money and gifts, the nobleman who did things with them that they didn't talk about in church. Harden held these affidavits in his hand like a royal flush. Eulenburg had just sworn under oath that he had never done these things. Now Harden didn't have to prove Eulenburg was gay. He just had to prove he was a liar. Perjury was a felony. It carried a sentence of penal servitude. The state prosecutor, previously trying to protect the establishment, could no longer look away. The evidence was too specific, too corroborative. The Munich police were dispatched to interview the Bavarian witnesses. They confirmed the stories. On May 7, 1908, the unthinkable happened. Philipp zu Eulenburg, Prince of the Empire, heritable member of the Prussian House of Lords, Knight of the Black Eagle, and best friend of the Kaiser, was arrested. He was not taken to a palace. He was taken to the Charité hospital, under police guard, because his health was collapsing, but he was a prisoner. The charge was perjury. The Eulenburg affair had morphed from a libel trial into a criminal prosecution of the highest order. The Kaiser's protective bubble was gone. Wilhelm, terrified that the witnesses might mention his name next, that his letters might be read in court, did the only thing his panic allowed him to do. He washed his hands. He ordered the partition between himself and Eulenburg to be sealed. He reviewed the list of honors Eulenburg held and prepared to strike them out. There would be no help from the throne. Eulenburg lay in his hospital bed, watching the ruins of his life smoke around him. He had played the game of power and lost. But the final act of the drama was still to come. The trial for perjury was scheduled for the summer. Harden was going to bring his Bavarian fishermen to Berlin. He was going to put the prince and the pauper in the same room and ask the prince to call the pauper a liar. It promised to be the most humiliating spectacle in German history. And Philipp zu Eulenburg knew he might not survive it. The summer of 1908 in Berlin was stifling. The heat rose off the asphalt, baking the city in a haze of dust and tension. But the temperature outside was nothing compared to the fever gripping the Moabit criminal court. It was here, in late June, that the German Empire finally put its own soul on trial. The perjury trial of Prince Philipp zu Eulenburg was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a spectator sport of grotesque proportions. The newspapers called it the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. For the working classes of Berlin, it was a grim vindication. For decades, they had been told that the aristocracy was a different breed, morally superior, ordained by God to rule. Now they watched as the curtain was ripped away to reveal a man who was not only mortal, but allegedly depraved. Maximilien Harden, the architect of this destruction, sat in the gallery, watching his handiwork. He had done the impossible. He had forced the state to prosecute the Kaiser's best friend. But Harden knew that the battle wasn't won yet. Eulenburg was a prince. The judges were conservative. The system would do everything in its power to protect one of its own. To win, Harden needed his torpedoes, the witnesses from Bavaria. Jakob Ernst and Georg Riedel stood out in the sophisticated Prussian capital like raw timber in a velvet salon. With their sun-weathered faces, calloused hands, and thick Bavarian dialect that the Berliners struggled to understand, they were the grim embodiment of Eulenburg's past, coming to haunt him. They looked uncomfortable in their Sunday best, twisting their hats in their hands. They had no idea about high politics or international diplomacy. They only knew what they remembered from 20 years ago. The nice nobleman who came to the lake, who paid them well, who was kind, and who touched them. The contrast was absolute. On one side, the witnesses, men of the earth smelling of fish and milk. On the other side, the defendant, Philipp zu Eulenburg, a man of perfume, poetry, and power. But when the trial opened on June 29th, the prince did not walk into the courtroom. He was carried in. Eulenburg was a wreck. The months of relentless hounding had shattered his health. He was suffering from severe heart trouble, thrombosis, and nervous exhaustion. He was brought into the court on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets, looking like a corpse that had briefly opened its eyes. The judge, showing a flicker of mercy, allowed him to be transferred to a special invalid's chair. The sight of the broken old man silenced the crowd for a moment, but only for a moment. The prosecutor began his work. He wasn't there to pity the prince. He was there to determine if the prince had lied to God. The testimony was excruciating. The Bavarian men were called to the stand. Under the harsh lights, they recounted stories that would have been scandalous if whispered in a brothel, let alone spoken in a royal court. They described boat rides on the dark waters of the Starnberg Lake in the 1880s. They described the odd behavior of the count. They spoke of kisses, of embraces, of specific acts that violated paragraph 175. Riedel, the milkman, was particularly damaging. He spoke simply, without malice. He just described what happened. He described how Eulenburg had befriended him, how they had drunk wine together, and what had followed. Eulenburg sat in his chair, his face a mask of waxen agony. Every word from the milkman's mouth was a nail in his coffin. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was losing his history. All the years of service, the diplomatic triumphs, the music, the letters, all of it was being erased, replaced by the sordid narration of a summer fling from 20 years ago. When it was his turn to speak, Eulenburg's voice was barely a whisper. He denied it all. He claimed the witnesses were mistaken or lying or bribed by Harden. "I have never," he rasped, clutching his chest, "defiled my honor." But the denial rang hollow. The sheer volume of detail provided by the witnesses was overwhelming. The court was turning against him. The judges exchanged glances. The specter of a conviction, a prince of the empire in a common prison cell, loomed large. Then came the climax, a moment so theatrical it felt scripted, yet it was terrifyingly real. It was mid-July. The cross-examination was hammering Eulenburg relentlessly. The prosecutor was drilling down into the details of the Bavarian testimony, forcing Eulenburg to confront the specific accusations. "Did you, or did you not, on the night of—" The pressure became too much for the human heart to bear. Eulenburg gasped. His hand flew to his chest. His eyes rolled back and he slumped forward in his invalid chair, unconscious. "Doctor, get a doctor!" Screams erupted from the gallery. The proceedings descended into chaos. Medical officers rushed to the prince's side. They checked his pulse. It was erratic, thready. He was having a heart attack or a stroke or a complete nervous collapse. They declared that continuing the trial would kill him. The judge banged his gavel. The trial was suspended indefinitely on grounds of the defendant's health. Eulenburg was carried out of the courtroom on his stretcher, unconscious, past the jeering crowds who shouted "Perjurer" and "Schweinehund." It was the last time Philipp zu Eulenburg would ever be seen in public. He survived the collapse, but he was a dead man walking. The suspension of the trial was the worst possible outcome for him. If he had been convicted, he could have served his time and perhaps found some peace. If he had been acquitted, he could have tried to rebuild. But a suspension, it was a purgatory. He was legally innocent, but publicly guilty. The indefinite suspension meant the charge of perjury hung over his head like a sword of Damocles for the rest of his life. He was returned to his estate at Liebenberg, but it was no longer a sanctuary, it was a prison. He was stripped of his passport. The police watched his gates. He was under house arrest in all but name. But the most brutal punishment did not come from the court, it came from the palace. In the days following the collapse, Eulenburg waited. He waited for a telegram, a letter, a messenger, anything from the man he had loved and served for 30 years. He waited for a word from Liebenberg. It never came. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had once written "I belong to you," now acted as if Philipp zu Eulenburg had never existed. The Kaiser was terrified. The trial had been too close. The testimony about romantic friendships had come dangerously near to describing his own relationship with Eulenburg. To save himself, the Kaiser had to perform an act of psychological amputation. He ordered the court chamberlain to strike Eulenburg's name from the list of guests. He demanded the return of all gifts. He practically forbade the mention of Eulenburg's name in his presence. It was a Stalinist erasure before Stalin was even in power. The Kaiser's best friend was unpersoned. Eulenburg, lying in his sickbed at Liebenberg, slowly realized the truth. The friendship that had defined his life, the spiritual bond he believed was sacred, was nothing more than a liability to the crown. He had been the Kaiser's therapist, his emotional crutch, his only truth teller, and for that, he was discarded like a broken toy. The scandal was technically over. The newspapers moved on to new crises: the naval arms race with Britain, the troubles in the Balkans. The crowds in Berlin found new things to shout about, but the damage was done. The Eulenburg affair had left a crater in the center of the German establishment. It had destroyed the moderates in the government. It had hardened the Kaiser into a bitter, isolated man who now surrounded himself only with yes-men and generals who told him what he wanted to hear. The soft, restraining hand of Eulenburg was gone, replaced by the iron fist of the war party. And deep in the countryside, in the silent halls of Liebenberg, a broken old man sat by the window, watching the seasons change, waiting for a letter that would never come, while the world outside marched blindly toward the abyss of 1914. The gates of Liebenberg Castle closed with a heavy final clang in the summer of 1908. For the next 13 years, they would rarely open. Inside, the man who had once held the heart of the German Empire lived as a ghost in his own life. Philipp zu Eulenburg was not in prison, yet he was the most confined man in Germany. The court had suspended his trial indefinitely due to his health, a legal limbo that acted as a life sentence of silence. He was a pariah. The local villagers who had once doffed their caps to the prince now looked away or whispered as they passed the estate walls. The mail brought no letters from Berlin, only bills and legal notices. His existence became a slow, quiet tragedy. The troubadour who had sung for the Kaiser now sat in silence. The piano lid remained closed. The rose gardens he attended with such care were now walked by a man who looked decades older than his 60 years. He was plagued by blindness, heart trouble, and the crushing weight of depression. But the physical ailments were nothing compared to the emotional amputation he had suffered. Eulenburg spent his days sorting through old papers, perhaps reading the copies of the letters he had written to Wilhelm, the originals having been burned in the panic of the scandal. He analyzed every interaction, every moment of their 30-year friendship, trying to understand how Liebchen could have abandoned him so completely. He never spoke a bad word against the Kaiser. To the very end, Eulenburg maintained a heartbreaking loyalty to the monarch who had ruined him. He viewed Wilhelm not as a betrayer, but as a victim of the same dark forces, the jealousy of the court, the malice of Harden that had destroyed himself. It was a delusion, perhaps, but it was a necessary one. To admit that Wilhelm was simply a coward would have been to admit that his entire life's devotion had been a waste. While Eulenburg rotted in Liebenberg, the Germany he left behind was changing, and not for the better. The scandal had done exactly what Maximilien Harden had hoped it would. It had surgically removed the soft influence from the Kaiser's ear. With the Liebenberg circle destroyed, the ring of silence was replaced by a ring of steel. The Kaiser was now surrounded almost exclusively by the hardliners, the generals, the admirals, the blood and iron nationalists. There was no one left to tell him to calm down. There was no one to take him hunting and talk about art. There was only the echo chamber of militarism. Historians have often speculated on the what-ifs of the Eulenburg affair. If Philipp had remained at the Kaiser's side, would he have been able to restrain Wilhelm during the July crisis of 1914? Would his diplomatic tact and his hatred of war have steered Germany away from the cliff? We will never know. But we do know that when the guns of August finally roared, the one man who might have argued for peace was sitting alone in a castle north of Berlin, a broken outcast labeled a pervert by his own country. The war came and went. The German Empire, which had seemed so invincible during those parades on Unter den Linden, collapsed in a heap of ash and hunger in 1918. The Kaiser fled into exile in the Netherlands, chopping wood to pass the time stripped of his throne, and still Eulenburg waited. He lived to see the fall of the dynasty he had served. He lived to see the birth of the Weimar Republic. And finally, in September 1921, the end came. Philipp zu Eulenburg died at Liebenberg at the age of 74. His death was barely noticed by a nation struggling with hyperinflation and political chaos. There was no state funeral. No representatives from the former court attended. The Kaiser sent no wreath. The man who had once been the ambassador to the Kaiser's soul was lowered into the ground in the family cemetery, taking his secrets with him. But if Eulenburg's life ended in shadow, his legacy cast a light he never could have imagined. The scandal that destroyed him had an unintended paradoxical aftershock. By dragging the love of friends into the courtroom and onto the front pages, the Eulenburg affair had shattered the taboos surrounding homosexuality in Germany. It had been brutal, hostile, and mocking, but it had made the invisible visible. Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the sexologist who had testified in the trials, didn't give up. He used the momentum of the scandal to push harder for reform. He argued that if a prince could be destroyed by these archaic laws, then the laws themselves were the problem. The Scientific Humanitarian Committee grew. The debate moved from the whispers of the aristocracy to the loud, chaotic, free-thinking streets of Weimar Berlin. In the 1920s, just a few years after Eulenburg's death, Berlin became the gay capital of the world. It was a golden age of queer culture, cabarets, magazines, films, and a level of openness that wouldn't be seen again for decades. This explosion of freedom was, in a strange, twisted way, the child of the Eulenburg scandal. The tragedy of the prince had cracked the foundation of the old moral order, allowing something new to grow in the cracks. The story of Philipp zu Eulenburg is often read as a political thriller or a courtroom drama, but at its core, it is a tragedy of identity. It is the story of a man who tried to live in two incompatible worlds. He tried to be a Prussian aristocrat, bound by duty and steel, while simultaneously being a sensitive, romantic soul who loved other men. He believed he could keep these worlds separate, that he could serve the state by day and play the harp by night. He believed that his class and his friendship with the king would protect him from the consequences of his nature. He was wrong. The Eulenburg affair exposed the ruthless hypocrisy of power. It showed that a society built on rigid masculinity will always eventually devour those who don't fit the mold, no matter how high they rise. The Kaiser loved Eulenburg for his softness, but when that softness became a political liability, he sacrificed him without a second thought. The friendship of souls proved to be weaker than the fear of scandal. Today, looking back across the chasm of the 20th century, Philipp zu Eulenburg appears not as a villain, nor entirely as a hero, but as a martyr to a transition he didn't understand. He was a casualty of the war between the old silent world of aristocratic privilege and the new loud world of modern media and public morality. He died believing he had failed. He died believing his name was synonymous with shame. He couldn't see that his suffering was part of a much larger, longer, painful arc toward freedom. He was the first high-profile victim of a conversation that is still going on today. The conversation about the right to love, the right to privacy, and the collision between who we are in the dark and who we are allowed to be in the light. His life teaches us that the personal is always political, that silence is not safety, and that even the most powerful men can be broken when their hearts defy the laws of their times. If you visit Liebenberg today, the estate is quiet. It is a hotel and a conference center, beautifully restored. The forests where the Kaiser and his troubadour once hunted are still there, the trees tall and silent. In the park, there is a small memorial stone. It doesn't mention the scandal. It doesn't mention the trials or the perjury or the fall from grace. It simply marks the place where a man lived who loved beauty in a world that demanded hardness. But perhaps the true monument to Philipp zu Eulenburg isn't in stone. It is found in the archives of history, in the dust of the court records, and in the tragic, beautiful letters that survived the flames. They remind us of a time when a prince and an emperor sat by a fire, holding hands while the world burned, convinced that their friendship was strong enough to withstand the coming storm. They were wrong, but in their failure, they left us a story that refuses to die, a story of the terrible price of being human in an inhuman world.